Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new Wealth Talk, an exclusive series of talks to provide our Santander private banking clients with expert opinion on issues that, in one way or another, might impact the global economy and markets. The talk today will be in English, but you can listen in Spanish by pressing the red ES button in the upper right corner of your screen. La charla hoy será en inglés, pero puede escucharse en español pulsando el botón en la parte superior derecha de la pantalla. To ask us the question, simply use the question comment option located at the top of your screen. Today, Victor Matarrán, Global Head of Wealth Management and Insurance, will be interviewing Clare Shine, expert in sustainability and member of the Santander X Innovation Advisory Board, who will share her insights on what needs to be done to achieve relevant progress in sustainability. Back to you, Victor.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you very much for organizing this once again. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this new Wealth Talk. As you know, these are Santander Private Banking's series of one-on-ones with experts in different topics. Our guest today, as Cristina said, is Clare Shine. Clare is a director and the CEO of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. This is an institute that was founded in 1988, as far as I know, to promote leadership and solutions for a sustainable economy. Clare is also a member of the Santander X Innovation Advisory Board, which makes us very proud. She's an associate of the Institute for European Environmental Policy and a member of the IUCN Commission on Environmental Law. She, when you read what Clare has done, I mean, she has been at the nexus of sustainable development, organizational change, and culture for over a decade, 3 decades, sorry, 3 decades. Wow. And she has a very clear view on what needs to be done to make progress in sustainability that we've been talking about for a long time. So the title of today's talk is The Great Realignment. I guess with that, you can figure out what we will be talking about. But without further delay, welcome, Clare. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
All right. So before we start, and out of curiosity, so how come somebody who is not a scientist or a researcher or a professor or something like that, who's been a lawyer actually at some point, I guess, and a theater critic, so has ended up running one of the world's most influential sustainability organizations? How did that happen, Clare?
It's a great question, Victor. And first of all, hello, everybody, wherever in the world you are sitting. I didn't plan my pathway. I come from a small village in the United Kingdom. But when I was a teenager, my father, an engineer, was posted to Africa. And suddenly I discovered the desert. I discovered what it meant to think about development and changing the way that countries ran and that economies ran. And I saw at firsthand the choices on the land for people. And so I went to Sri Lanka as an 18-year-old to work for a year in community development and was tangled up with the beginning of the Civil War. And for all those reasons, once I had my first degree, my law, my business experience, I decided I wanted to work with the future. And for me, that future was sustainable development. And I've just returned to the UK after 32 years living and working on every continent across the world. And I'm very proud now to lead this institute in Cambridge.
Wow, amazing. How long did you live in Africa? Very long?
My father was there for 3 years, but in my own professional career, I've worked on assignments right the way across the continent. I speak bilingual French, and for Africa, it's very valuable to have people who have both languages when you're connecting different parliamentarians or business communities.
Fantastic. All right, so you chose the Great Realignment as the topic, no? And you put quite a lot of emphasis on the future. When we talk about climate and sustainability, obviously they are all over the place, and we are talking a lot about it. But yet the narrative is quite disturbing generally, and quite negative. I would say, no. So we talk about extreme weather on the rise, doom and gloom. Do you think that we can really change course, and at some point we won't be talking about all these things in that way, or is this the way it's going to be? What do you think?
Well, we have to change course. There is no business on a broken planet, and there's no business in a broken society. So the crises we talk about are real, and we have to address them. But the narratives around them, the way we talk about them, I think that can often be really problematic. Everything is described in terms of cost, without enough on the benefits, and in terms of disaster, rather than what we can do to preempt and change tack. There's a French political ecologist, Bruno Latour, who talks about the failure of the way we talk. We're either in extreme panic or extreme boredom. Now, neither work. They don't persuade business people to change their mind or politicians to change their mind. Marketing experts will tell us that nothing sells from a negative. The problem now is we're waiting for tipping points. We react in general when the danger or the problem comes close to home, even when we know that these problems are happening far away and they are cumulative. So for me, this is a really fundamental attribute of leadership in this space, is to call out tomorrow, to understand, yes, the change is inevitable. We have to face up to the disruption, the ambiguity, and have the courage and vision to bring a new lens onto what is possible. And understand too, a really exciting thing, which is that's the way that demand is shifting across our societies, putting ourselves onto the right side of history, if you like.
Oh, very, very interesting. And you mentioned tipping points. So talking about that, let's go a little bit into geopolitics and the economy. So we are, I mean, the sad event of the year has been the conflict in Ukraine, and it has had some sort of domino effect on worldwide now in terms of lower energy security, inflation, higher cost of living, of course, and strains on the interstate relationships. I like to think that it's not only the war in Ukraine, there are some hidden effects that were there, and just because what you said on tipping points, these things surface, no, but still it has changed quite a lot, the dynamics, and suddenly we see like governments having to choose between, okay, I'm going to stick to my plans of renewable energy, or I'm going to get back to fossil fuels and things like that. So it looks like it's kind of taking us some step backs in the transition. So what do you think is going to happen in the short term, and what can we do to kind of keep going and not just go back at the moment, but at the same time avoiding short-term problems?
It's a really tough question. I mean, the stakes right now are really high. Far too many people risk going cold this winter and going hungry if they're not already hungry. And those food security crises are spread across the world, of course. It's not just close in Europe. We've got to understand that we must link the energy transition, the transition to net zero and a low carbon world, and energy security, as well as food and water security. If you alienate and exclude vast numbers of people, you will lose that backing for the transition. And yet the worst thing to do right now that would collectively put us on the wrong side of history would be to go into reverse gear on that energy transition. As you said, Victor, the Ukraine invasion pushed this up the agenda, but the underlying needs that we faced as a society to shift to that low carbon world, we knew that, even if our policies and our markets and our investments weren't keeping pace with the need that we knew of. So we're seeing at the moment that indeed the climate change agenda has been pushed down the political agenda because of these crises. Leaders are distracted, and we can see with an analysis of country net zero targets that action is slowing. There's an ambition and an implementation gap. And yet, when we stand back, we look at the economics, the technologies, the imminent breakthroughs are all on the side of renewables, new carbon capture and storage methods, and much more. So I think that there are a couple of factors, really. One, communication and leadership, again, really matters in this space. Where there is a necessity to keep open or to pursue some carbon-dependent technologies, that must be understood as an interim and not a critical piece. But very often, I think there are things we can be doing now that don't require the reopening or the investment in fossil fuel-dependent approaches, and I would strongly support that. So keeping up the momentum for climate environment action. Now is the time to keep accelerating that shift to renewables, to restore investment and incentives for insulation, which have been stopped in many countries, to get energy efficiency measures really scaled up so that we can support demand reduction. Just in Europe, some countries are doing it, lots of countries are not. Let's keep that conversation moving forward. And I should add that in my own organization, we're very involved at the European level with the Fit for 55 package. And we continue to harness the voices of politicians and business people and finance to keep up the ambition of the package and not see it watered down. Because, as I say, that will put us on the wrong side, not just of history, but of what society in its majority really wants now.
Yeah, what is very, I don't know how to unsettling is that it's very hard to see really a clear position from each of the countries at the moment. It's like we see all these problems coming, we are getting into winter, and if you ask me, I don't really know what what each one is going to do. But anyway, that's I guess that's where we are. I completely agree with you. We need to keep going and push to avoid delaying or going backwards and take transitionary measures if needed. No?
If I could say a very brief extra remark there, this is the moment when true diplomacy, true thinking about what statesmanship looks like really counts. We could very easily move into a very transactional space when we look only at, as you said, the short-term gains, the near-term national interests, but understanding the need for solidarity, both between countries and within countries, I think is very important. And that brings up all kinds of interesting questions about the ways in which governments will target the financial support. You know, we'd all like to have lower energy bills, but I would expect that, like myself, most people who are joining this conversation don't have to worry about paying their energy bills. Whereas, and we're seeing movements in society where people say, I don't want this reduction from the state because that needs to go to the people who, without it, will definitely go cold.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think it's a test of courage, leadership and solidarity.
Completely. And hopefully all that surfaces out and soon enough. We have already like 400 people connected to the conference. So I hope that you are enjoying. But talking about keep going and with the measures, etc. In 2 weeks we will have the new COP, the COP27. This year it's in Egypt, I guess. And it follows the one we had in Glasgow last year, that it was quite hyped. And as you said, Africa is close to your heart and knowledge. So what do you think it's going to be the topic? What are they going to be talking about there?
So we have massive unmet needs for climate finance and adaptation support for developing countries. And the Paris Agreement had 3 key goals: emissions reduction, adaptation, and long-term finance, that we have to bring together in Egypt at COP27. They are interdependent, and we have to bring the work streams together to build a credible and just transition to net zero. I already mentioned that was an ambition and implementation gap on net zero, but I want to focus on adaptation and finance. There is a global goal to double international finance for adaptation by 2025. Often it's the poor relation. It's not talked about nearly as much as emissions reduction. And on the finance side, this is an amazing opportunity to really think about how we mobilize global capital flows to meet the trillions of dollars that we need in emerging economies and developing economies to both decarbonize and build climate resilience. And in that context, we are extremely interested in thinking about new approaches to partnership. A lot of the conversation around these COPs, these conferences of the parties, tends to revert back to what governments can do, what the multilateral development banks can do, and so on. And yet, from a private finance perspective, there is far more money, far more opportunity to apply those capital flows in really innovative partnerships. So between government, between central banks, between private institutions, to accelerate that function. And if you think about how the innovation profiles, the new technologies, the new opportunities, the opportunities for new jobs and businesses are building up, to turn that narrative around, as I said earlier in our conversation, and think about the way in which bold deployment of that capital could have co-benefits or multiplier benefits at the level of societies, of jobs, and speeding up new technologies. I think that's really the kind of positive lens that is really important. And I should add, it's really important that this is the first COP, climate COP in Africa. It's a big moment. And because COP28 will take place in the United Arab Emirates next year, that in itself is something, it's a global pivot geographically to where the eyes of the world will focus in terms of looking at this shared challenge and opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I mean, from our point of view that we live in the investments world, I would add a positive note to that. And it's when we talk to clients about energy transition and adaptation investments related to that, normally the reaction is quite positive. It's an area where everyone understands that there is a huge demand and huge commitments. And probably the problem is there, as you said, is the kind of the transmission chain, because there's not enough offer for all those people who could even be investing more in this, and it's not really well structured. So there's quite a lot of work to do there. I completely agree.
Definitely. And, you know, I wrote a piece in the Sunday Times recently, which touched on some of those kind of mechanisms that we need, exactly as you say, Victor, to free up and give reassurance to private investors who want to contribute and get engaged. The ways in which we can make it easier to build those partnerships with low and middle income countries. What are the kinds of guarantees or reassurances that with the mechanisms of states or overseas guarantee companies or whatever form it takes, that we can bring the smarts and the data of the public sector into the space of private finance in interesting ways. No,
completely agree. So this is in Africa, and I can't help thinking about inequality, which is a kind of underlying topic in all that we are talking about. So I mean, we are seeing a lot of news. Inequality is rising in general, and it's a growing cause of concern. So how do we fight it? How can we businesses help, and what happens if nothing is done? Because I think, I mean, in many of what you were saying, this was there, and if you think about it, it's quite also concerning. So what is the situation there? What can businesses do? What can be done? How do we fight it?
Yeah. So first, you know, inequality really matters. If we talk about inclusive societies, resilient societies, they will never be achieved unless we are honest and open about tackling inequality. So even before COVID, we knew that decent jobs, provision of decent jobs, access to decent jobs is absolutely foundational to delivering the famous Sustainable Development Goals. The COVID pandemic aggravated many pre-existing inequalities in society, and it particularly hit, for example, young people, women. It reduced the social safety for informal workers, and we've all seen around us an increase in young people who are not employed, in training and so on. So those factors create precarity and fragility in society. Businesses have a huge stake in providing decent work, and we can think about that term really through two lenses, both job quality but also job quantity, the way in which business can help to stimulate labour market demand to open up decent jobs for a wider section of society. That can play out in different ways. If we think about corporations and their global supply chains, again, I seem to keep coming back to this word leadership or being a first mover. This year alone, for example, Unilever announced their commitment to pay living wages across the entirety of their supply chains by 2030. I know they're not alone, but what we've seen over the last decade is that when a financial institution or a business puts a stake in the ground in that clear way, it focuses attention, and it can also have a really good catalytic effect. You mentioned investors so Victor, and you're much more expert than me. But the research, the research that we've done, we host the Investment Leaders Group here in my institute in Cambridge, which brings different perspectives of groups around the world together in this space. And the research that we've done with that group has shown that where people have good information about the sustainability of their holdings, they make more sustainable investments, but specifically when they're shown information about how their investments could support decent work alongside other social and environmental factors, they're more likely to choose products or production processes that avoid harming people and planet and help to create those jobs. And that, on our data, suggests that they would sacrifice 2 to 3% of financial returns. I haven't got all the data in front of me in terms of looking at giving that overall benefit. We're also now starting some really interesting sort of analytical work looking at the financial materiality of inequality. And there, our banking environment group has come together with our investment leaders group and our climate-wise insurers group to sort of pool that thinking and understanding about the risk profiles for finance that are associated with inequality. So for all those reasons, I think that we always need data, we need robust foundations to give business the reassurance that if they show leadership in this space, they're doing it on not just on really strong foundations, but reputationally, and in terms of long-term profitability, it's going to make sense as well.
Very interesting. One thing I would say on the investment side, which is this is more of a personal opinion of what we are seeing now. So we are in a process now of defining what is sustainable investment, et cetera, et cetera. And my view is that even with what you said of the 2 points of return that you can sacrifice, it's even not needed at the moment because we are here, and you can go to a very narrow definition of sustainability that probably would compromise returns. But if you stay in the middle somewhere, you make a big change and you don't really need to sacrifice anything. So
completely. And, you know, the S word, sustainability, is very wide. In some ways, I like to just say, let's just call it common sense. But when you think about the number of rising, growing, expanding sectors that play into deep human well-being, thriving cities, competitive businesses, you can absolutely align investments for sustainability with great success. And I think that's going back to what I said earlier on about the narrative, that shifting the narrative, not to be naive, we need to be grounded and open to the risks, but really understand that putting that positivity back into the space, we're humans. We want something. We want to feel that what we do drives something positive.
Completely. I completely agree. And it will be the standard also at some point. So anyway, we are derailing here. But so let's get back to what we were talking about. So when I read on your papers and the things you've published, I think you highlight some things about what is called the crisis that we are talking about, no? And you always talk about this triple lens, I think, let's hope I say it right, about for people, nature, and climate. And you talk quite a lot about the need to put humanity at the heart of the sustainability narrative, no? So what do you mean with that? What do you mean with this putting humanity at in the middle of that?
So I think a lot of the language that is used around all these big fancy topics can feel quite alienating or overwhelming or very abstract for ordinary people, and even more so for the people who are perhaps most vulnerable to the kinds of changes and risks that we've been talking about already. And there, in the early days of the environmental movement and these big treaties, and I'm old enough to have been there at that time, there was a huge sensitivity in many parts of the world that this was essentially a set of language, a set of frames of reference being developed by one part of the world that had a set of benefits and in a way talking to other parts of the world, which brings us back to that question of interdependence and also voices and influence being heard on equal terms. So I think what we now talk about or don't is a really interesting lens on what we actually value. As economic actors, we're often more comfortable talking about products and processes that can be quantified, owned, controlled, or just innovative and more sexy. And that means that when we shift to talk about nature or human well-being or the communities that rely on it, those have until very recently been the poor relation in the global sustainability debate when it comes to what business and cabinets, political cabinets, are really talking about. It is changing, although not fast enough. I think COVID changed the terms of the debate, even though not, and I hope it will stay, because it reminded us of the deep need, whether you're a business leader, whether you're an ordinary human or both, of our deep need for community bonds, for contact with beauty and nature, the fragility of physical and mental health, how fast things can tip. Yeah. And more fundamentally, and this is a quick final point, when you look forward, there are very fastly changing dynamics between people and power, with technology being a major driver of that. So, if any of you who've got, kids who aren't babies will know that, we have access in our pockets to levels of knowledge, analysis, and scrutiny that we never had before.
Amazing.
Next gen can scrutinize decision-making. They can scrutinize what's being done with their pension fund. And therefore, there is an ability to build movements for change fast that I think will cut through to decision makers in whole different ways, harnessing new routes to cultural and creative expression that cut through the noise differently.
Absolutely. And so let's talk a little bit more about this. So what change could look like and who can drive it, no? So everyone is talking about this kind of thing, sustainability, etc. It's in everyone's mouths, no? And we see all the companies talking about this. But still, we know that the kind of shorter term business priorities can get on the way of moving ahead in this agenda. And we have this big risk of greenwashing, that it's so much high in the agenda, and it will be probably higher over the coming months and years. So if we look at the business world in general, how much has actually changed from, we've talked a lot, but is that real? Has anything changed? And in any case, what can be done to accelerate it, no?
Yeah. So, I have quite a lot of frustration in this space because right back in the early 1990s, we looked at the question of getting companies and producers to pay for environmental externalities, the things that happen to the outside world but that are not usually reflected in the actual price of a product or service. So phrases like the polluter pays came from the OECD back in the 1980s. And yet we all know that free riding continues, that a company can get the profit of its activity while society and vulnerable communities are actually paying for the impacts down the line. So shifting that round and really thinking about that, rewiring the economy so that there is what we might call true cost accounting is very important. So then when we come to ESG, it's the same question about where's the rigor, where's the scrutiny, where's the transparency. We are seeing a politicization around the ESG debate at the moment. And those of you who track politics in the United States will have seen, particularly in some of the southern US states, a real backlash against some of this language. It's assimilated to being woke, etc. I think that in terms of making what we currently call ESG deliver, and also to balance up the environmental part, the social part, and the governance part, is one of the big challenges of our time. We're seeing the expectations from the clients and the regulators rising steadily. It's obviously, that's a big driver for financial institutions to think about the rigor and the quality that they apply, and to take a longer term approach. And also to understand, as I mentioned earlier, the real materiality of risk in not doing this. What will it take? We're going to need clear standards. I hope eventually consolidated standards that are just more intuitive and easier to apply. Yep. Accountability, transparency, but also I want to highlight the role of informed and active boards. There's a big piece of movement happening now in terms of upskilling boards to feel more confident and more literate, not just on climate, but also on nature and the societal aspects. And that's a very important part, both for boards to support their senior management, but also to be able to challenge senior management if things are done under a label, but which aren't really at the cutting edge. So very interestingly, a quick final comment, I've just come back from Singapore, and the Singapore Stock Exchange is one of the first in the world, if not the first, that has mandated ESG training for people who are joining board, who are becoming directors on public boards. And my own organization has been accredited as one of those training providers. Anecdotally, I heard in Singapore that in the few months since this came on board, that people have already seen a really interesting shift in culture and the way that conversations are framed. So that was probably rather a long answer to your question, but I think it's one of the most important issues.
It was very clear, and actually, it gives me a good segue to the next question, because with all this, are you kind of proposing that we should be rating the companies in a different way, maybe around their purpose? Purpose is one word that you use quite a lot as well. So should we change the way we look at companies or look at this and have kind of good or bad companies depending on the general purpose they have around this? Or
well, it's such a huge question, isn't it? I mean, the days of thinking of a company as being about profit maximization are long gone, or they should be. We have to really be thinking about that long-term profitability that takes account of the environmental and social impact, as I mentioned. The companies and leaders that don't get this now are going to suffer. It is well understood in the literature, and I'm not saying anything original, that incremental change, just slightly tweaking today's business and economic models to think that that will deliver the sustainable outcomes we need is not credible. Less bad business won't be enough, and it will be called out by markets, by informed consumers, informed investors, even before the regulators catch up. If I may say that without sounding rude. So from the point of view of transformation, how business considers its role and its value to society is not just common sense, it's also entirely logical in terms of what the demand of its own employees and the wider society, how those are aligning. Our research, which is multi-tiers, has been fascinating. It shows that the shift to being purpose-led can really operationalize sustainability, because it actually aligns our desire as individuals for meaning with the interests of society, business, and nature. We're seeing that more mature purpose-driven companies are increasingly able to display purpose across all aspects of their organizational culture, from their hardware like systems and processes through to their software like their assumptions, their practices, their behaviors. And something I really want to highlight before I pass back to you, Victor, is that companies can't and should not try to wait till they get everything right. We're all on a journey. We're learning. The science is moving fast. The politics are moving fast. So we would suggest that the important thing is to be transparent about the goals, to carve a robust plan for transition, which engages employees, gets people excited, and then to build momentum with stakeholders for delivering that shared purpose. Again, in Singapore, some of the data I saw from companies like Dentsu, which work very closely on marketing and consumer attitudes with a whole range of clients, was absolutely incontrovertible that the companies that are making that shift to what one might call deep purpose, sounds a bit sinister, doesn't it? But really putting purpose at the heart, are really seeing returns on multiple levels for having taken that approach. Can I add something else in there, Victor? I think my organization, as you mentioned, develops leadership and solutions for a sustainable economy. And one thing that has caused some real surprise over the last year is that we've now really started to focus on family business, on influential families, on high net worth players as a pivotal part of the transformation of the global economy. And that's for a lot of reasons. One, in many parts of the world, it's actually those family businesses that are driving a lot of change. They're embedded in their communities. They're very proud of their heritage. Very often they have a different kind of relationship with their employees, with their wider communities, with the wider players. And that means that they've got huge influence both as huge employers, and a nimbleness and a natural long-term view to lead the way in these kind of transformations. We've recently created ourselves a new multi-generational leadership program to create a forum for those kind of conversations. And trust, of course, absolutely fundamental there, because for families, when they're thinking about intergenerational dynamics, we all find that hard in any family, but it's much harder if your family is in the spotlight. And again, the data we were seeing from Asia, where there's an enormous concentration of family businesses, was that the biggest driver in the economy at the moment for organizational transformation is coming from next gen in ultra high net worth or influential families and business ecosystems. I was absolutely fascinated.
It's very interesting, and actually, I mean, I'm a bit of a suspect here because I work with them a lot, but it's something that I always say, that these kind of individuals play a specific weight in the economy as change agents and agents in general, that it's beyond what normally people would think, because they join their individuals world with their corporate worlds, they employ a lot of people, etc., etc. And also, I completely agree, and I'm sure among the audience you have some people that will be more interested in knowing that. So please let us know if so, and we will channel it to.
Of course, I'd be delighted, and I think that a word that I love is stewardship. I don't know how you say that in Spanish, I'm afraid, but
it's
the idea.
A very complicated word to translate. I never find it.
But the ability to take a long-term view, but that is grounded in your roots because of that family identity, is really unusual. And for me, I actually think it's one of the most exciting catalysts that is out there at the moment. We're also working, as it happens, with the luxury sector, which again was a surprise to me, but is one of the most enjoyable parts of my work, because what is pioneered in the luxury sector is on our high streets a few years later. So if those organizations with the influence of the choice architecture can lead the way, then the chance to scale up new approaches goes even faster.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what happens when you get down to small and medium companies? Because in the end, they are most of the companies are small and medium companies. So how can you kind of create this sense of purpose and all that when you have this huge community of SMEs around the world? How do you reach them?
It's a great question. We've been really scaling up our focus on SMEs over the last couple of years, including putting free resources out there for training kits for net zero transitions and so on, because we're all very conscious that for SMEs, they have very small capacity very often, and how can they possibly stay on top of all of this? So there are now free global platforms. I mean, the World Bank supports some of them that really help to connect those voices, but also through the lens of supply chains, to actually have a much closer and more intuitive link to the big businesses or the family businesses there. Interestingly, in our new headquarters here, I'm just standing here right now, we're opening an incubator for SMEs, startups, and entrepreneurs, and we're planning to build global partnerships, virtual partnerships with SME hubs around the world to give that kind of support. But it's really good that you mentioned that, and I think it ties back into what we talked about earlier about job creation, about decent work, and about giving opportunity to youth and women as well. Because particularly for people who haven't had the academic track, very often their first chances to develop their own livelihoods and independence may come through the informal sector or through SMEs.
Very interesting. And we can take it to the next step, no? Because then you come to the individuals, to the consumers, no? And they all need to kind of sacrifice some things in their daily consumption habits, etc., and change lifestyles, no? To support here. So how do you create this purpose as well in the individuals? And how do you at the same time satisfy their needs, no? Because you have to do both.
You do. I think this, for me, is one of the most important focus areas for the next frontiers in this conversation around sustainability. We are just setting our new strategy, and Future Lives is going to be one of our key poles, because when you think about, I mentioned before, the way in which culture, tech, and societal movements influence what we do, we all see around us that that's how movement building can happen much faster than anything that happens through, grown-up board papers or political resolutions and so on. I think the way in which through social media and just being permanently connected, attitude shifts can be connected across the world and again be coordinated to put pressure on for change is really remarkable. But as you say, Victor, with that, we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking of things through a global north or wealthier European lens and so on, because a very important sensitivity here is the fact that our countries have grown wealthy on the back of practices which we now know are unsustainable. And that's what takes me right back full circle to the mutual responsibility we have to think as a global community now for that great rebalancing or the great realignment, as I mentioned before. I should add, though, again, this is not doom and gloom. The innovation capacity that I see when I'm around Africa, Latin America, wherever, including frugal innovation and that finding of solutions in resource efficient ways can be really remarkable. And I'd love to see nimble capital being available there to sort of get these kind of community driven things going and taken to scale, so that co-creation and human-centric design is part of what humans are really looking for. We want a voice, we want a stake in society, and we want a stake in our own future. And that is, I think, an important dimension of the sustainability conversation.
All right. So with all that, would you call yourself an optimist about all this?
I am absolutely an optimist. It does come from my roots. My grandfather was a shepherd in Ireland, and he got his first pair of shoes when he was 12. And my mum was the first girl in her town to go to university. Wow. And I found myself at Oxford, and now here I am in Cambridge. So I'm not trying to be silly and say that's one person's example. But going back to, let's get away from doom and gloom. We have incredible capabilities as humans, and we have enough money. It's what we do with those capital flows, how we think about it, that will make the difference. We have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty already. We are seeing levels of technical ingenuity that are quite extraordinary. So I think we don't just have, I'm not just optimistic, I think we collectively, and a group like yourselves, we have a duty of hope. Because right now, in these scary times, we also need to project the art of the possible, that together we can drive a better future. And if we don't do it, who will?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you're optimistic, I'm an optimistic too. That's all I needed. Okay, and I'm sure many other people will do after listening to all of this. So we have a few questions from the audience. We had about 500 people connected, and let me just go through them in no particular order, because I think we have some time for some. So the first one says, this is interesting. So which ones do you think have been the key lessons of the pandemic in terms of sustainability?
Okay. I think I'm just thinking aloud. I touched earlier in the conversation on the fact that I think it renewed a sense of our needs to be able to operate and connect as viable societies. So when we were forced into that level of isolation and fear, it reminded us what it was to be truly human, and actually that no amount of material things can compensate for these things which are less tangible, but without them we can't really make our society flourish. So that's one. The second, I think, and I'm probably telling you the obvious here, is that when governments have to act boldly, they can. So again, why do we have to wait before it's a huge emergency to have much bolder mobilization of resource? And the third is that it is absolutely paramount to think of ourselves, think of the interdependence and solidarity globally. With the vaccine, we know that we all went after our own, getting enough of the vaccine into our own wealthier countries, and many poorer parts of the world had to wait far longer to get that rollout. And yet we knew at exactly the same time that the moment that travel reopened, if countries hadn't had access to the vaccines and they then resumed travel, we would be renewing that cycle of infection. So that is an example around the pandemic. But if we think out more broadly, we ignore these interdependencies at our peril. And if I may build off that, one of the things that we just do not look in the face, and I've tried in my little way, is, for example, thinking honestly and openly about demographics and migration and the climate pressures on people. When I was first trying to work on this 7 years ago, the estimates of how many people will be displaced from their lands by what we call climate migration, the climate impacts, vary between 50 million and 250 million. Now, most of that displacement might be within a country, but we only have to look, for those of you who are in Europe, to think back just a few years about how our societies and our politics reacted to relatively small numbers of migrants. So if we want to think about the viability, real solidarity, we need to be thinking now about how people can have viable lives and thriving lives in their own countries of origin and connect the dots.
That's very, that one on the immigration is very interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah. So I have another one here. It's a bit tactical, but I will ask it anyway. So it says, so what will happen this winter? Will I need to burn my chairs, or will I be fine? I guess it depends on where you are.
Well, I laughed, but it's damn serious, of course. I think it depends where you're sitting. And I think it depends on both political and economic choices that relevant governments take, and also how communities come together. So, we have both an issue of cost, the affordability around energy to stop you having to burn your chairs, but we've got the issues of supply and how we're going to be able to think about getting in supply and distributing that supply in a way that hopefully is more balanced than perhaps we saw sometimes over vaccine distribution. Certainly, I'm sitting here in the UK now, and there are people in acute hardship, food, energy, and so on already. And that's why I referenced earlier in our conversation that thinking about how governments or financial institutions, in terms of their loans or short-term support, how we are able to actually stand up and really look at those, really target what we do at those who might in normal circumstances have viable small businesses and viable things, but who could go under right now if we take a short-term view or we don't target support in the most effective ways.
Absolutely. It's an important thought, and we should all be thinking about that. I have one other here, and I apologize in advance. So it says, how does the sustainability agenda look now in the UK? Yeah. With complex political and economic context happening? It's a good question. I have to.
It's a very good question. It's very good. It's a very good question, and it's very live. I wouldn't dare to jump into the very specifics of what's happening in number 10 Downing Street, because it may have changed this afternoon while we've been on the call. I think a really concerning issue for us and our institute and all the groups that we work with is this the risk of going backwards in terms of talking about growth as if it was fundamentally opposed to, for example, keeping protections for nature. Again, to have this kind of knee-jerk reaction. We know that the way that we need to think about long-term sustained and sustainable growth is not about let's screw up our waterways, let's concrete over even more of the town, etc., etc. So my worry in some of the way in which the narrative goes forward is that it starts to look as it's either nature, it's either protected areas or it's growth and so on. And I think candidly, that's not a helpful narrative. And we certainly, working with our leadership groups where we bring together progressive business voices and finance voices, from time to time, we we work with them to sort of develop letters to political decision makers in Europe, in the UK, and so on. And that was something where we found very loud resonance with the progressive leaders, just saying, no, we have to absolutely keep our eye on this true north, because in the end, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, viable societies, thriving societies, competitive cities and countries where business wants to invest, don't do that by, putting it crudely, screwing up the environment. Every bit of data will show you that the cities that are greening, that are becoming more accessible, more creative, more cultural, more welcoming, those are the cities that are going to win out in terms of the competitiveness stakes. Okay. So a kind of short-sighted, short-term rush for things under a banner label of growth is, to my mind, not at all helpful.
Wow. Absolutely. Absolutely. I have two questions from the Institute, but one actually you answered already. So that was spot on, because they asked about if you have any research in the Institute about the differences among groups of population in terms of millennials, new generations, wealthy people versus the. So I guess you answer that a little bit in the family office.
I didn't go into details on it, but I think it's a rising part of our work going forward. So within our leadership and education portfolio, we have launched now 12 online courses on different aspects, 8-week tutor-led courses, and which are being, have participation right the way across the world. But what is very interesting is that the highest demand recently for those kind of courses has been around, for example, marketing, creative economy, communication, the kind of soft industries, if you like, where younger people going into those industries know that they need to have a really deep understanding. We had a partnership last year with the UK Advertising Association, because these sorts of bodies know that they are mediators of the messaging put out by companies and clients. So they are aware of their responsibilities in terms of what they help clients develop, but also the need to have a deep understanding to be able to get better product or better advertising and marketing for those same clients.
Right. So I guess, and this is the links to the other question. So I mean, I guess the impact that you can, so the impact that you can have on the work that you can do from the Institute is very clear. But I guess the question is, do they listen to you? Do they? I mean, how much impact can you actually have? Do you see like the government, regulators, etc., listening to you and institutions like you, or you feel like a little in the middle of it?
Yeah. I'm proud to say yes. It's always tricky to work out exactly what metrics you apply to impact, especially over 30 years. But just as a couple of concrete examples, in the UK, the Climate Change Act, which was one of the first in Europe, was a direct initiative that came out of our corporate leaders groups based on the research that we had done. We work very closely now with different European institutes and stakeholders, including at the highest levels of the European Commission, and along with business coalitions like We Mean Business and various others, looking at how you can really think about these integrated pathways for change and what it will take. And that is a really interesting mix of obviously robust data, great policy design, but also thinking about how do you connect different business networks in the different countries of Europe? How do you bring voice together in ways that cut through the noise and make sense to policymakers? So there we know for multiple reasons that, the things we're doing have stood the test of time. But I think it's also relevant when we think about individual transformation, because everybody on this call, whatever you do, controls the flow of resource or influence in different ways. So, one story I can tell is that one of our early participants in our flagship business and sustainability program made the decision when he attended that program in 2002, he's Dutch, that he would ensure that biodiversity and climate were in his portfolio as he went up the corporate ladder, and he ended up in CEO positions. And the first thing that met me on my first day in this new job was a message from him saying, oh, right, you've joined there, right. Can you now get me a complete strategic leadership program for my entire corporation? So it's really interesting to see how what we're trying to do ourselves, and it's a journey, is to change from a kind of network thinking, oh, you've done a program, you're an alum, to a genuine global community of action, and to think about not just how do we hold relationships with individuals, but how do the wonderful organizations that are corporate members or financial members of our community start to think about how they can be actors in a community, a global community for action. And that is very interesting in terms of a completely different co-creation model for all our alumni and relationships right the way across Global South as well. So that's actually something that I'm personally very passionate about, because we're all busy, crazy busy. So finding ways that make it easier for concerned individuals, concerned companies to stay engaged, and then to take that down even to the most junior levels of their employees, I think is really promising. I should add that I have had CEOs say to me, if I don't do this and do it quick, my efforts to recruit the best will come to nothing. Okay. So, you know, we're all struggling to get talent out of the recruitment marketplace, but the good side of that is that talented young people are able to choose. And my goodness me, they are putting their values and their long-term interest, as well as, quite rightly, their career development into a really interesting balancing place now.
All right. And it seems like you're going to be even busier, if that's possible at all. But I have one here that I didn't have this perception, or not so strong, but it says, COP26 was in some way disappointing with regards to the real outcome achieved. What needs to be done to make sure COP27 result is different? I'm not sure if you have the same perception, but I didn't have it so strong.
In a way, it ties into what I just said. How do you go from something that's a moment to a genuine, continuing push for change? I'm going to come back partly to leadership. I think lots of important things happen in COP26, but how you keep a sustained, visible focus in a positive way comes down also to how our senior politicians, senior business leaders, keeping that up, keeping it visible, really making it part of our new normal, if that doesn't sound too cliche. And there's always a difficulty with those kind of events, that people will see them as talking shops, or pitting global north wealthy against global south demanding, to put it in air quotes, of course, or just a jamboree for those who can, you know, use air miles and hop on an aeroplane. So you really, I think we have a duty, back to that word, I think we have a duty to deliver off these kind of events. And coming to the question about how do we make COP27 deliver, one of the things that we're doing, I talked before about nature being the poor relation. Some of you on the call may know that just a month after the Egypt Climate Conference in Montreal, we will have the Biodiversity Conference, COP15. So what we're doing with many of our partners is talking about COP to COP, using these two big global events a month apart to bring the business community together around the nature climate piece together. And as far as I'm aware, we're hoping that Justin Trudeau will be there for a meeting focused on finance to support the nature climate transition. If whoever the politicians are, getting senior people into the room to use their influence, their convening ability, and keep up the momentum is, I think, something that has to happen to avoid the cynicism after a COP, as the questioner suggested.
Exactly. All right, and I think we have time for one final question, and I have one from Maria. So Maria, thank you for putting down your name there. And she says, in this trade-off among the fossil fuels and the renewable energy, do you believe that nuclear energy is a viable alternative or not?
Well, I'm not a specialist, but I think it's part of the mix. I think that there are, at the moment, I'm not, as I say, I'm not expert, but I think that we really have to be able to think about these hybrid energy mixes and use the tools that are available to us, but also be open to think about different types of scale. I mean, very often we think of nuclear and we think of either the disasters, understandably, or the enormous projects. And yet, just as we are democratizing energy supplies or finding much more mobile or innovative ways to think about energy generation, I think that some of those options are open to nuclear as well. The economics of it are very tough. I'm not going to claim it's my specialist area, but I think it's, again, being able to have a conversation and not have it immediately be very polarized is a tricky thing, but a very important thing here. And how that's handled will obviously vary between countries, depending on their particular geographic opportunities and so on. I'm now back in the island where I was born, which is surrounded by the sea and therefore incredible opportunities for offshore wind. And I'm now in a position where I see far more sharing between countries nearby on the technologies, on how we can move it forward faster and so on. But other countries may not have some of those possibilities. And so I think we just have to keep really open mind, but really robust and with that good sense of the blend we need to get to.
Absolutely, Claire, and hopefully it is that way. So I'm afraid we must say goodbye now. Time's up. But first of all, I mean, Claire, thank you so much for being here today with us. It was very, very interesting. It was very enlightening, and I particularly personally enjoyed the way you put it, which is not doom and gloom for sure. It's all about the ways to achieve our objectives and to live with purpose. So thank you very much, and I hope we can talk again soon.
That would be my absolute pleasure, and thank you all for coming along. I know how tight your time must be.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for connecting, and remember you can watch the talks at santanderprivatebanking.com anytime. Thank you for coming, as I said, and please join us again for another insightful conversation in a few weeks. Take care.